Dugin, far from proposing a toast to the health of the Thiel ideal, um, is describing it as something that is quote extremely ominous, unquote, and all but identifying Thiel himself as the Antichrist. Um, so, is every encounter with Mr. Thiel, let's pretend that Mr. Thiel is one of Strauss's puppies. He's just patting him on the head. So, because Thiel is in some way like a student of Strauss, and this is sometimes how Strauss's students were understood by some onlookers, or maybe I think even by Strauss himself, because of the closeness of his personal students and to himself. So what's the idea there is, what's Dugin saying is, since he's for something like the preservation of the human being as it is now, or perhaps as it would have been in Dostoevsky's time, thinking more peasant life. But I think he thinks really of peasant life as he's experienced it. Not that he was a peasant; he was the son of an intelligence officer who was named Gili, because Gili means, so I am told, helium in Russian, and since that was during the Soviet period, that was a Soviet name. But nonetheless, I think Dugin has experienced the life of a peasant, been out in the country and lived that way enough to see that as sort of a core way to be human. And then, just as we were discussing in the other video, that Dasein can direct itself towards imagining and realizing Byron swimming the Hellespont because this was done in myth, or because something actually happened before people lived this way and it was good. Socrates lived in such a way that he had very fruitful discussions with, especially with the youth around Athens, and also with, and even with hardened political men like Meno, and the generals who are historical figures. One of them being the richest man in Athens, who had some kind of silver mine, I think. But so we could see that there's real ideals that we would then want to conserve, like Zeus engaging the diamond needle on a record player, and then the record would play forever, the eternal recurrence of the same. Or at least that's one interpretation of eternal recurrence of the same. And then there's this guy Thiel saying, no, we want to go further into the transhumanism. I'd say in between that, you could get somebody like Giertych, the papal theologian, and just listen to the way he makes the argument for that we have to understand homosexuality as an illness. We're told not to make people miserable because they are like this, but not to regard it as as something we should propose a toast to the health of, but to regard it as probably what they would think is something like, there's this race, the race of dwarfs or midgets, and they have a history, they have let's do another one, because I know this one is actually true, is the blind. So we have the history. The Catholics think, there's this race or genus called the blind. There's always among us, but we can't regard them as the perfect example of a human being, or as the right example to emulate of a human being. But there's a race among us. They have achievements, and they're to be valued in many ways. So I think that's the proper Catholic way of thinking about it. And then I should point out that something that interfered with that was that after the 1848 revolutions, the idea of being a nation caught on, it caught fire. And so that actually happened in America too, strangely enough, even though America was already long since 1776, or since a few years before with the founding document. Um, or sorry, did the Declaration of Independence come out in 1776? I'm getting my no, it was a few years before. Right? So in any case, the point is, America got infected by the idea of the 1848 revolutions, from which that beautiful lie arose, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, which has been so thoroughgoingly stomped on by the enemies of the Nazis, because the original meaning of that was, it's like Germany, Germany, all. The ideal, the German ideal, the Germanish ideal, Deutschland, Deutschland, above all the scattered principalities and the struggles betwixt us. So something like the way people are saying today, like like Bill Clinton said, we can't get, there's no possibility of a divorce. Like Democrats and Republicans, there's no possibility of a divorce. It must be settled. So that's what the original meaning of that lie was. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. We're all come together into one nation. And yeah, so in that sort of transfigured way, into this rage-filled Nazi form of it, it was still, they're saying the same thing. That's what the 1848 revolutions are about, nationhood. So we could see that in that milieu, they had not yet come to the problem that we're coming to, that we have come to, which Thiel is basically. Because it wasn't really possible. It wasn't really the world. I mean, even though people thought of world government, it still was so remote. Whereas now it becomes almost tactically ready to hand. This question. So the question, which he motivates one. I'll include the video on the notes. The 1940s atomic bomb thing. So that which just motivated, by the way, the attack on Iran. The supposed obliteration from the face of the earth of the Iranian nuclear program, because the idea being, if we have nuclear bombs and they don't, we're safer, and somebody has to have all the nuclear bombs. And so this is one way he's thematizing Antichrist as this master of Darth Vader emperor figure. I think though, so I mean, that's a very low way, the Star Wars way of putting it, but it's popular, so people know about it. But I think the most beautiful dramatization of the Antichrist ideal in this sense would be the first. So Dylan Meyer has been pushing to Kristen Stewart, High and Low, which is the economic. I mean, I don't say this totally to be silly, but just it's economic. Critique. It's a critique of economy, basically, in a lot of ways. I think maybe that's part of what attracts her to it. But I think, for my money, what's way more interesting is Rashomon. So the most beautiful dramatization, the most ideal bringing into existence of this Thiel ideal is the first scene of Rashomon, and especially when the double starts abusing his lord in Dynamo. And it said, you accuse me of being a theft, and you've stolen entire domains. You shed a sea of blood. And then the beautiful answer he makes to that, which is unparalleled, I think, just in its accomplishment and its technical perfection. And it's inimicably Kurosawa manner, which nonetheless seems to be somehow generic and perfect at some very disappearing high level. there's a confusion between his personality, just in the way we say there's Japanese architecture, or there's the architecture of the age of the architects. So it's like, even today you could say that you're supposedly Zaha Hadid, or all these other architects are doing things that are radically special, but then they're all using the same materials. They all have the same technical limitations, et cetera, et cetera. So that, in a way, in the age of the architects, things look almost more like a single monolith style than did the Egyptian style, or the Japanese style, or whatever, the Gothic style. But when things reach that level of intensity, like the Winkelmann saying about the beautiful, the noble silence, and the grandeur, or however the things go. But just meant to signal these cultures were more focused on their single idea, and they couldn't think about anything else. But maybe, whereas we're more open and diffuse or something, maybe that's not true. Maybe it's just that we're in it, so it's harder for us to draw it to our attention that we're, our times too are very parochial. Our times too are, 2,800 years, no, sorry, I would say, I think it's almost 5,000 years ago, there were discussions between Palestinian princes, Syriac princes, and probably Tutankhamun, or in any case, pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. And we know this from huge numbers of tablets have come down to us on these diplomatic communications. But that 18th dynasty lasted about as long as America. And it was centuries were long then too. All kinds of things happened. And we have a funny way of, even though we say, oh yeah, there's anthropology and there's different cultures, we have a funny way of not noticing it in our Dasein, and not positioning ourselves accordingly. But in any case, okay, so you have this Thiel proposition, and I would say, let me just try to give my version of it, which would be, he's saying one problem is, how would the Antichrist, he's comparing two things. First, he's saying there's this atomic issue, and then for that reason you'd have to have some kind of a dynamo in charge. But then that also there's the Christian issue, and the Christian is slightly different. And so I think more on the Christian side, I put this account, which I think plays a big role, which is the Jeffrey Sachs version. And this, in Thiel basically does the same thing, but he doesn't mention Jeffrey Sachs. But when he talks about a world government that comes out of the United Nations, where the United Nations has a real effective power. So, but that's what I've been saying about Jeffrey Sachs' version, is it's beautiful, and he's a kind of saint of existence, as Wim Wenders called Goethe. And it's almost an exact comparison between him and Goethe in some way. And that's very complex. But because he's sort of right outside of the core. It's like Goethe was from he was noble, he was very privileged, he had lived the life of a polymath and a scientist, and he was wealthy, basically. But he was not in the highest nobility. He was, arrivist, or however you say it, in a certain sense. He couldn't, in the eyes of those people who were already established. House of Hohenzollern or whatever, I'm not sure exactly. And that's the story of Lotte, by the way. So to give that sort of a more thick-skinned version, the reason that Napoleon liked that book so much is because it's basically the story of a class struggle, and he too was in a similar position, whereas he was kind of an outsider, and then he became emperor, right? He actually was in the center. In a way, Napoleon is like Trump in that sense. Trump is kind of an outsider Yes, he went to Ivy League school, but they kind of didn't like him. And then, so he kept saying he's so popular, probably because he actually was a little bit despised by people in his school years, I think. And so then he became popular through his game shows and all that stuff. And that's a little bit similar to Napoleon, right? From an outsider who then, probably that's apocryphal, I think. I don't know that it's actually known that he crowned himself. It's in, I mean, I know it's in the painting. I think maybe the artist made that up because it's so beautiful in terms of expressing the actual psyche of Napoleon, or the actual thing that Napoleon was. But the reason Jeffrey Sachs is a saint of existence, one, Jeffrey Sachs, yes, he's a little bit in the outside and a little bit in that position. Also, he has a little bit of an Olympian kind of cast about him, just as Goethe's does. And you can see that Goethe's style is exactly what Kafka uses to give his works. It's like a little bit of extra politeness. It's sort of this funny politeness of somebody who knows how to be polite, but they're not so easy about it as the inner circle is. There's something like that, and that's what I think. That's what people call this sort of eternal feeling about, timeless feeling about Kafka's work, because he basically stole that, as Kleist did, from Goethe, or he kept with that stylized feel that gives that funny feel, but then he gave his own content to it. But so in this case, Sachs was accused by all the most educated people, everybody who was both extremely intelligent and a close observer of the political scene. Everybody was convinced by the story about the shock treatment. Jeffrey Sachs, the guy that recommended the shock treatment, and he did so. Of course, a lot of times in these things, what puts the nail in the coffin is that he actually used the phrase shock treatment. That's true. But for like 30 years, he was slandered this way. And then I think it must be true, is he said, what really happened, I think it can be checked. What really happened is what he recommended worked in Poland. And then his bosses in Washington said, listen, these are our enemies. We're going to crush them. We're not trying to help them. And so they rejected that. But they just look. So you could just look. There's a strategy used in Poland, and they refused to use that strategy in Russia, even though he recommended it, because these are our enemies and they're going to be destroyed. And then you had the 90s. And then Putin, the savior, comes in. I agree with Dugin. Putin is, one, metaphysically immature. Two, on my own, I would say he's a sociopath. And think of the thing about Prigozhin. He was playing with grenades while high. That's how he died. So Putin gets a cruel. He has a cruel streak. That's a cruel statement. That's why that Wagner chief died in a plane crash, because he was playing with grenades while high, because somebody had said something about him smoking cannabis or something. But in any case, Putin sort of set that period in order. I think that one of the best accounts is by one of his most extreme critics, Stephen Kotkin is probably the best on Russian stuff today. Although you have to realize he really hates the Russians, which is just why he's so gangster level serious about getting it right about operatively what's going on in Russia. So taken that way, I would say Sachs is the most Antichrist-like, in that he's the one that's really pushing and proposing with the most credibility that in the fullness of time we will see the United Nations ruling and being potent in its ruling, so that it could say Netanyahu's committing a genocide and simply arrest him. That would be what he's thinking of. I think. Um, that seems to be when you take his logic to the hilt. That's what you get, because of all his criticisms of the offenses to international human rights and to the genocide charge in Gaza, especially, and also the failures to negotiate in Eastern Europe. So I think that, to me, would then fill the place of the he gives the example of some novel or something with the Satan giving some kind of hypnotic messages, which seems to be some kind of fictionalized version of the theory of charisma somehow. I think Weber was the first to really. I think Weber invented that whole cloth, because there was nothing ever in political analysis about the charismatic leader before he invented that, as a specific form of analyzing what's going on in his version of existence, which was the kind of. But he says that there's no ideas. The Platonic ideas don't exist, but there's something else called the ideal type. So I think if you really understand what Weber means by ideal type, then you see a different worldview than ever existed before that. You see a different ideal takes charge and guides you all the time and tells you what's more serious, what we should be thinking about. The ideal type rather than the idea. So the ideal type then is basically all things that nobody has experienced, whereas the idea originally just means the kinds of things. The idea of a chair, because it has to do with sight. On sight, you see a tree, on sight. And then it's also carried over to, and then what Plato does is he makes the theoi in the Euthyphro. He shows that he only talks about the theoi in the Euthyphro, but what he's doing is basically preparing the way to make the total wholesale. He never mentions idea once. Transfer the idea of theoi into the idea of idea, so that he could carry it up to things like truth and justice and so on. And that's what our civilization is based on so far. That's the beginning of political thought. So that's 2,400 years, and that's basically what's collapsed. So that's basically what's going on. But in the sort of katekon, or however that's said, katekon, space where it's sort of, again, it's just like an explosion and it's happened, but it's just like what Nietzsche said about that star that's gone out, but the light is still coming for another billion years. So what's the difference? Because it's so distant. Yeah, in that space I could see, that's the real argument, is towards some higher enforcement of international human rights, which of course is like it gives the impression of being it favors the people that are already doing things that way, maybe. I don't know, it's a little bit confusing, because if it were actually applied, then wouldn't it mean a bunch of American presidents would have been arrested? Because we kind of think, it favors America, but if it were actually applied, I don't know. So yeah, there would be a lot of questions in there, but that would be a sort of flattening by main force. Force that could be enforced of the practices all around the world in some sense, right? Because then, a country would have to then be totally cut off from other countries if it were to maintain itself as a so-called rogue state, it would. I don't know. I guess in a way we already have that situation, but then we don't. It's kind of hard to. It's hard to think about it. Because, like, for instance, I think of that Russia's constitution is basically a Western constitution, and maybe even more Western than the Western constitutions because it was written so late. But they just don't follow it, so they evade it. So, but they do have those as the law in the book. Okay, was there anything else on this Thiel issue? I suppose what I would want to say is, on Thiel's saying that, he tried to claim that Christianity really does want transhumanism, so that's his claim, and then that puts him at great odds with what I was trying to say about Dugin's version, which is basically something that he knows and has experienced and is already there, but he wants it to be strengthened and, as it were, grow into the other people to accept it, rather than a project about improvement in some sense of the human being through largely technological means. I see in this disagreement, I think that there's a lot of problems there, and I would want to propose some other ways of moving forward, but I'll leave that to thematize another time.